The second time John Hancock's name was lifted to the top of Congress, it was less a summons to govern than a bet on the power of a signature. The war was over, the treaty had been ratified, the chair in the National Chamber had begun to pass each year to a different steward who kept the papers moving and the façade intact. In that rotation, which felt at once ceremonial and necessary, the delegates reached for a figure whose autograph had become the emblem of independence. They chose him again, the man whose ink in 1776 had swelled like a flag across the page, hoping that prestige could do what statutes could not, pull far-flung men to a seat of government that had money in theory and authority mostly on paper. He accepted with the politeness of a gentleman who knew what his name could do and what his joints could not. He promised to arrange his affairs, to take the road, to sit where the law now lived. He did not arrive. An absence became the shape of a year. Hancock's fame had been a public utility during the war. In the rough Parliament of 1775 and 1776, he had presided, not as a philosopher-king, but as a host who understood that a young nation needed ceremonies to teach it what it was. He signed resolutions. He sent congratulations and condolences in the name of a people just learning to say the word we. He lent to committees the gloss of his chair, and, in the most remembered gesture of that age, he wrote his name in an exaggerated hand beneath the declaration, so the British ministry, at whatever distance, could read it without spectacles. That generosity of display was not vanity alone. He believed in the theater of self-government, in the way exact minutes and handsome signatures could stabilize a room full of men newly loosed from deference. He was, by training and instinct, the master of the public event. The second elevation came in a different world. Peace does not erase debts, it changes there to whom. The Confederation was a machine built to calm jealous states, not to compel them. Congress could speak, it could not tax, it could ask the legislatures for money. They could decline with a courtesy stiff enough to pass for principle. It could draft rules for how the West would be measured and sold. It could not make settlers wait for surveyors who had not yet found their chains. It could send letters to London and Madrid and receive letters back headed with correct titles and little else. A government that can only request must perform confidence until confidence makes credit and credit makes power. No one in America understood that better than Hancock. He had spent his first presidency setting a tone before there were instruments. Delegates now hoped he might do it again, make the chair shine enough that men would sit in its light. What they also knew, and what they chose to look past, was that Hancock was in pain. The complaint had different names then, but its humiliations were the same: swelling, fire in the joints, days that ended in fevers and began in refusal. Travel was not discomfort but trial. He was every inch a public man, but the inches had grown slow. In Boston, he had the routines that made authority look effortless, domestic staff that knew the rhythms of his days, doctors who arrived with the tinctures that helped, friends who could carry business in and out of his parlor without making a spectacle of his limits. To uproot that careful world and make a winter's journey to the nation's seat, in a city whose hospitality was uncertain and whose chambers were drafty as principle, required a willingness he did not find. He wrote graciously. He meant to come, he did not. The chair could not remain empty, so the body did what it always did when theory met friction. It invented a workaround and dressed it in precedent. In the president's absence, a delegate could be chosen to act as chairman, presiding over debate and signatures, while the official holder of the title remained in the records, the one who had been elected. That fiction, useful, faintly comic, and entirely in keeping with the Article's habit of splitting honor from force, let Congress proceed. The gavel fell in another's hand. Letters were signed in another's hand, in the absence of the man the world knew. It was governance as shadow play. And it worked better than one would think, until the shadows lengthened past comfort. If a year can be summarized by the papers that cross a single desk, Hancock's absentee term is best understood through the documents that began, "We are honored by your acceptance," and then waited, and the later documents that began, "In the absence of the president," and trailed off into the ordinary sentences of appropriation and thanks. The National Chamber. newly settled in a city that wished to be permanent by insisting on it, had a calendar that needed keeping. Foreign ministers called and were received by the man available. Reports arrived from the western country where treaties signed with a flourish at forts on rivers were being tested against the arithmetic of axes and the geometry of fields. Memorials arrived from officers who had sold their commutation certificates at half value and would like to know whether there would be any justice beyond arithmetic. Petitions arrived from merchants who remembered that free trade had sounded like a song when it meant no British customs officers, and now sounded like a cough when it meant 13 states with 13 different tempers. In a system that lived on persuasion, paper was muscle. It had to be flexed daily. The acting chairman flexed it. Hancock, at a distance, shored up their effort with the silent capital of his name. There is a temptation to tell the story as an accusation. He should have come. If he accepted, he should have put his body at the disposal of a body that needed him. The truth is less useful to anger and more interesting to a history of institutions. The Confederation Congress had created for itself the ritual of annual elevation, a practice meant to prevent the kind of endurance in office that had everywhere in the world smelled like monarchy. The virtue of rotation was also its vice. Each year the chair had to be relearned. Each man's temperament pushed the docket in a slightly different direction. The lobbyists and petitioners recalibrated to a new ear. No one held the gavel long enough to build a staff equal to his habits. Into that churn, a celebrity could be a kind of binding agent. Elect the man with the most legible signature, and other signatures would be more likely to arrive. Elect the man who could be counted on to behave as if forms mattered, and forms would continue to matter even when he was absent. That was the logic. It was not contemptible. It was a conservative gamble in a season when boldness had lately been rewarded and was now exhausted. Hancock himself, in Boston, was not idle. A man who has been made into an emblem has to maintain the emblem. He received delegations and soothed factions in a state where the return from war had been as sharp as the departure to it had been exhilarating. Massachusetts tax law had grown taut and brittle, balancing the vanity of refusing paper emissions against the reality that specie was scarce and patience scarcer. In country towns, dockets filled with suits for debt. In county seats, auctions of farms drew bitter crowds. In taverns, the old talk of liberty turned strange, as if the word had begun to refer to courts that did not sit and sheriffs that did not call. In that weather, men who knew Hancock called on him to speak privately with those who proposed to moderate and with those who proposed to resist moderation by the ancient means. He could move a parlor better than he could move a legislature, and he could move a legislature when it needed the appearance of unity. He had always been a politic man in the 18th century sense, a man to whom influence came as easily as it was then acquired, with bottles opened in the right houses and family names invoked at the right hours. That work, invisible in a national register, was not invisible in his own. It was the busy dignity of an elder of a commonwealth that had lately learned to mispronounce federation as a favor to be granted or withheld. At the national level, the agenda that unfolded under his name, without his body, was the unfinished work of knitting a people into something that could bear weight. The land system adopted just before his election had to be put to work. Surveyors hired, townships traced on paper, then traced on the earth, auctions planned that would convert promises into coin. The Treasury superintendent kept trying to teach a set of states that there is such a thing as a common future and that it requires a common revenue. The impost plan, modest as a tax and mighty as a symbol, remained a plea in search of unanimity. Committees drafted more persuasive circular letters. The chair's duty was to get them out on schedule, and the acting chair did. Diplomats abroad wrote home, with bouquets of French compliments and thorns of British insistence, that debts be paid and posts be evacuated in the order, if at all, that would best serve British memory of empire. The reply had to be dignified, which is to say careful. The very presence of a famous presiding officer would have added a layer of gravity to that carefulness. His absence did not undo it, but it did deprive the place of some of its optical force. What his absence did reveal, for anyone who wished to look, was how little any single person could do inside a frame designed to make vigorous action unlikely. A president who sits every day and keeps the clock is invaluable when the machinery is sound. When the machinery is designed to be a forum rather than a motor, he can only turn discussion into resolutions and wish for a treasury to make the resolutions more than sculpture. Hancock, of all men, knew this. He had spent 2 years in the hottest time of the war using the assets of a presiding office to make the Army's need and Congress's gratitude seem like the two horns of a single instrument. He had spent more years afterward discovering, as governor, that what citizens call tyranny when it is in a king's mouth, they will call negligence when it is in a republic's. He had learned how easily a state's honor can be lost for want of a messenger or a chair kept occupied by an effective man. It cannot have been pleasant to watch his title used usefully by others while he arranged to take it up and found, every week, another reason to delay. That delay grew embarrassing, then clarifying. What had begun as a generosity, the acceptance that told the world the famous man still stood with the national center, had to resolve into something more honest. Letters were exchanged, courtesies were maintained, the posture behind them changed. The body needed a president present, if not for power, then for morale. Hancock sent his thanks for the election and the reminders that his condition did not improve enough to risk the journey. The fiction of temporary absence could not be stretched indefinitely without making the office look unserious. When it finally ended, the chair passed in a day to the man who had already been doing its work. The sky did not change color. The docket continued. The embarrassment did not become scandal because the work had not been neglected. But the episode taught a lesson that would be written more sharply a year later in a different city. That a national government cannot be a social arrangement of mutual complements. It must be a structure that assumes a person may be absent or ill or vain and yet still acts. Hancock's reputation did not collapse under the weight of the non-appearance. It had been built for too long on practical favors and public spectacles to be undone by a season of letters. The people who wished to scold him could point to the very qualities that had once made him indispensable: the flourish, the party, the preference for influence over grind, and say that he had reached an age when the grind mattered more than the flourish, and he had chosen wrongly. The people who wished to excuse him could point to a record of service, to the humiliation of a disease that turns stairs into mountains, and above all to the fact that the national government's poverty was a constant, not a consequence of his reluctance. Both sides were right. A different man might have forced himself into the carriage and made a drama of endurance. A different frame would have made the drama unnecessary by making the office less dependent on the theater of presence. The more important consequence of the year lies in the way it helped ripen a conviction that had been growing across the states, that a union which depended on the good health and good nature of notable individuals was not a union that would last. In one state, merchants watched their neighbors erect tariffs against them as if the war had been fought to replace the British Customs Office with 13 little ones. In another, farmers watched creditors descend with writs written in a diction that tasted of London more than of liberty, and asked whether the promise of the Revolution had been a promise about who would collect debts rather than about whether debt would be the definition of a man. In the West, families watched surveyors stake a grid through forests and wondered which set of papers would survive in a country that had so many papers and so few sheriffs to enforce them. In all of that, the National Chamber tried to look like a place where these tensions could be not merely heard, but decided. Electing a famous figure to preside had been an attempt to thicken that illusion into truth. The refusal of his body to comply with the wish made the wish more visible. It also put into relief another aspect of Hancock's public self, his instinct for the symbol that calms. He had been in Boston, a man of pageantry who used parades to reconcile factions, and used toasts to sew up quarrels. He had made the Great Resignation in Annapolis feel like a benediction by staying out of its way and then praising it perfectly. He would, in time, resume the governorship of Massachusetts and again make the visible rituals of office into the invisible oil that keeps the political engine from seizing. His absentee presidency belongs to that same repertoire, though inverted. He lent his name to a national ritual and let others pour the oil. The car kept moving. The spectators, knowing or not knowing who sat behind the wheel, saw the same seal on the door. If one looks for a single substantive question that the year under his name tried and failed to answer, it is the question of revenue. The impost had been imagined not as an invasion of state dignity, but as a narrow channel through which the states could pour a part of their trade into a cup held by all. One state's suspicion of its neighbor's advantage, one legislature's fear of the next election, one faction's pleasure at making a point about liberty by refusing to accept a duty of a few percent, all outweighed the national plea. The presiding office, with Hancock absent and another in the chair, did what it could, kept the polite pressure up, reminded the holdouts that honor had creditors too, praised adoption where it came, and tried to make shame do the work that law could not. It did not suffice. The resulting thinness of the national purse can be measured in every minute in which resolved becomes recommended, and every letter in which we desire takes the place of we direct. The presiding officer, whether named Hancock or another, could not change the verbs. The other question was westward, and here the papers that passed under his title tried at least to fix a habit. Land would be surveyed before sold. Education would be written into the squares. New states would be admitted as equals rather than kept as provinces. Indian nations would be treated by treaties whose words were more often honored when convenient than when just. It is a mark of the Confederation's odd mixture of vision and blindness that it could append a school to every township on a map, and fail to imagine the grief it was drawing with a straight edge across land it had not learned to see. That mixture did not go away when a new charter came. Under Hancock's name, without his voice, the Congress continued to practice it, half noble, half obtuse, entirely American. There is a modesty to the way his second presidency ended that fits the man better than fevered reproaches do. He did not cling. He did not manufacture an explanation that blamed others for a circumstance that everyone could see. He let the body move on and return to the rooms where he could still make a difference, rooms that smelled of Boston and not of the seaboard's constant argument about where the capital ought to be. He would come back into national visibility again, not as a presiding officer, but as a state leader whose approval or disapproval of reforms mattered. He would lend his prestige to the settlement that replaced the Articles, not so much as a theorist of executive energy, but as a practical man who had watched a government try to live on promises and knew how the effort made it cough. What should be made, then, of a year in which the most famous man in the room was not in the room? It is tempting to say it proves that the Confederation was a farce, that men played at sovereignty while the real decisions were made by creditors and cartographers and mobs. That is not entirely wrong, but it is insufficient. The year shows, too, the resilience of procedures. The chamber found substitutes and called them by names that hid how makeshift they were. The calendar continued. The foreign correspondence remained punctilious. The westward ordinances were put into motion. The impost campaign kept its breath even as it failed. What the government lacked in muscle, it tried to make up in posture. Posture by itself cannot lift weight, but it can keep a spine from collapsing before help arrives. Hancock's absence did not break the spine. If anything, it clarified for everyone who cared to watch that the posture had become the whole body. The argument that followed, first in a conference that met to talk about trade and found itself talking about everything, then in a convention that met to talk about everything and decided to draw a new frame, was made easier by the memory of a year when the government had to write in the absence of the president more often than anyone thought appropriate. The judgment on Hancock's choice is, finally, inseparable from the larger judgment on that frame. A system that turns the head of state into a moderator cannot demand that the moderator redeem the system by theater alone. A chamber that depends on notable men to attract attendance must expect, sooner or later, that the men will be tired. A country that has asked citizens to live for years on paper will need, at last, a cash drawer. Hancock had been a brilliant custodian of the Revolution ceremonies. In his second elevation, he was asked to be, once more, a custodian of ceremony in a period that needed something more like engineering. He correctly judged that his body could not endure the trip and that his name could. He let the name do the work it could. Then, when candor required it, he let the name step aside. Picture, for a last time, the room where he was expected and did not come. The chair is occupied by another man who has learned his voice and measured it to the walls. The papers at the front are arranged in the neat fan that clerks prefer. The petitions still smell of the saddlebags that carried them. Outside, carts rattle over stones, and the harbor masts bob like punctuation marks. The acting president calls the body to order in the formula that has begun to sound like the Republic's heartbeat. Somewhere to the east, in a house that has earned the right to be quiet, a man in a silk dressing gown writes a letter in a hand that has become an emblem. And in that letter, he says politely that he is indisposed and that he will be grateful if the kindness shown him by election can be matched by the kindness of accepting necessity. Politics is not only the art of the possible, it is the art of naming what is impossible without turning honesty into insult. He knew that art. He had practiced it longer than most of the men now sitting under his name practiced anything. The country would always imagine him with a pen poised above a page. There are worse legacies. In the accounting of that year, then, put down neither catastrophe nor triumph. Put down, instead, a government that learned one more of its limits and then agreed to consider a new design. Put down a celebrity who let others borrow his light in order to make their work look more like authority. Put down a lesson, small and specific, about how far prestige can carry a weak institution, and put down a larger lesson about what it cannot carry. Put down an absence that taught presence its value. Put down, for Hancock, the peculiar dignity of knowing when not to appear. He had once made a nation by writing his name very large. In this season, he helped make a different point by letting his name be large without him.